Our next panel, titled Driving Change and De-risking Real Estate. This panel of experts will discuss the value of stranded assets, why they are an opportunity, their life cycle, and why increasing numbers of companies and investors are realizing this can extend the life cycle of their assets, and how the perception of those assets must change as we evolve and move forward. You can look at their bios by scanning the QR code, but today we have with us John Hatch, partner, the architectural firm of Clark Catton Hints, Mike McGuinness, Chief Executive Officer of NAIOP New Jersey, and George Sowa, the Chief Executive Officer of Greater Trenton. Okay, are we rolling here? Okay, so I'm gonna start with George. George, what do you feel are the root causes of the stranded asset problem, particularly in Trenton? You know, is it the economy? Is it the age of buildings? Is it the pandemic, technology? You know, what are all the causes?
Sure. Well, thanks, Anthony, and thanks to BIA to bring everyone together here in Trenton. And when you think about it, you know, this event today is very indicative of what's happening here across the country in terms of we have a number of folks here in person, but a number of people on a virtual event as well. And so business is changing, and as a result, it's impacting how people use space, where they locate, and why they locate. So you go back to the root causes of things, you know, you think back to the beginning of time, you know, 1980s, when IBM really invented a business computer that people could put on their desk and start to work from anywhere at that point, where you know, I look at my own career, you know, I was working in New York, commuting from Trenton, and then convinced my boss that if he wanted me to work on the weekends, buy me a computer for the house. And so I was an early remote worker, if you will. So I was working Saturdays and Sundays remotely, and you know, during those days they called it telecommuting, and although back in the early 80s they didn't even have a term, but it continued to evolve to where we are today. But again, when you think about you know, where we are today though, and the pandemic certainly amplified the impact of the whole thing, but you know, buildings are in places where people may not necessarily want to be or certainly be used in those same ways, and so it results in a whole list of issues. And then compounded by the economics of the whole thing, where if you own a building today at a high basis, what do you do with it? Especially if it's no longer desirable, if it's functionally obsolete, bad location, at least for the intended original purpose. And so it's a complicated question for sure, but when you look at the economics, for example, you know, and Willard mentioned our residential study. In residential, it usually breaks down to dollars per square foot per month. And that study on a blended rate we came up for Trenton here, we had 1,270 units of unmet demand in Trenton that could be absorbed over the next 5 years. But when you apply the rent of $2.10 a square foot, you multiply that by 12 to annualize it, it's about $25 a square foot. So that really becomes your income, the gross income that you can use as potential income for a different building. And then you apply that to where the office is, or other buildings, and say, okay, that's kind of my upper metric, if you will, for the income side, and then you start to neutralize or equalize for the expense side of it, and then you start to say, well, what that gap is. And that's where it starts to get tricky. And we'll talk about some of the details beyond that, but you know, I can go on the entire session, but I know we have other panelists here too, so I'd love to get their thoughts as well. But it is a complicated question that when you have an existing building that's operating, you then, and Matt, you talked about it, where you can make some marginal improvements. And so if you have a class B minus building, can you make it a B and maybe get some office tenants and what that incremental investment is? But if you have an abandoned building, like we have here at Roebling Block 2, for example, we had some buildings that go back to the Roebling manufacturing days that have been vacant for 50 plus years. It's a different scenario there because those buildings no longer in use, and you can't just make an incremental investment. And so again, it's a complicated question, but we'll dive into it here during the discussion this morning.
Okay. Mike, looking at stranded assets around the state, is adaptive reuse the preferred game overall in development? Is it the only game in overall development today in New Jersey?
Well, it's certainly a more common, it's being explored in a more common way because we do have so many of these vacant retail or abandoned, central business district office buildings or retail buildings. But not every building clearly qualifies, since the finished product must serve the market needs and be useful for its purpose and competitively priced, as George was saying. Having said that, in the last 2 years, New Jersey's seen about 6 million square feet of office space converted to multifamily. So it is happening. Some of that's gone to industrial, but most of it's gone to multifamily housing. I mean, certainly in our land-constrained market here in the state, more developers are tackling this issue. They're having their professionals come in to, pencil it out and see if it makes sense. In many cases, it does not. I mean, if it's a niche type building, like one of these vintage landmark buildings in a central business district, they're very attractive for multifamily housing, and renters, buyers will pay for that. So they see the value, because you can open the windows, and you don't get that in new construction necessarily.
Okay. Well, I guess that leads us to John, right? When does it make sense to redevelop a stranded asset from, a cost perspective? As an architect, what do you look at?
Well, so reusing a building is typically less expensive than new construction. Now, the trick is to find a use that fits well into the building. So, the existing building has a particular footprint, particular column grid, all of that. So not every existing building is useful for every kind of new use. So there's, you have to find the right match.
Okay. And then let's take some examples. For an apartment building, what do you look for to convert a stranded asset into a multi-dwelling?
Well, I'm glad
housing
you
unit?
asked that, because I'll show some
Okay,
slides.
very good. All right.
All right. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and show a few slides, just some examples of different buildings and how they can be reused. So this is actually Block 3. George mentioned Block 2 of the Roebling Complex. So these are historic industrial buildings, and so in a city, this is kind of can be a typical stranded asset. It's a variety of buildings, different footprints, and I'll touch on 3 of them on this particular site. So this is Building 101. It was used for manufacturing small diameter wire rope. You can see it was in terrible condition. But its footprint is pretty ideal for a number of uses, but in this case, it was pretty ideal for redeveloping as loft apartments. Now, it's not perfect because it's a little bit wider than we would like, and the bays are about 17 feet on center, so it works well, but if those were slightly wider, it would have been even better. But it's a pretty ideal loft building, and so these are 1- and 2-bedroom loft apartments. Here's what it looks like now. This is Roebling Lofts, and this is what a typical unit looks like. They're all double height, 18 to 22 foot high ceilings. Every unit has a loft. And this, on the top floor, there was an old testing machine, which we kept, and so that's the lounge for the building. So that's a pretty ideal reuse of one kind of building for apartments, and it's because of the dimensions and the column grid. So here's another building. This is the carpentry shop, Building 110. This had been vacant for 30, 40, 50 years, was in terrible shape, but heavy timber construction, but we restored it, and so this is what it looks like now, and this is now the headquarters. The top floor is the headquarters for, sorry, that's a little faded, for Princeton Hydro. So this could have been reused for apartments. We laid it out for apartments, but this was kind of also a great size for kind of boutique, the right kind of office tenants. So Princeton Hydro, they're an environmental consulting firm, and we started talking with them pre-COVID. We built it during COVID, so we kind of redid it a little bit with more kind of open and interactive space, really to encourage their workers to come into work to the office.
Okay.
Another building, this has the largest footprint on the site. This is building 114. The footprint is so large that it makes no sense for housing. So this could be reused, and we've laid it out for a number of uses: office, light industrial, research, could be hydroponics, all of that. And right now we're marketing this building this is building 114, and we're marketing it for pharma research. And so here's how it could look when it's done. So this is a building in downtown Trenton. So I'm using Trenton kind of as a case study for this variety of building types. This is 28 West State Street. Was built as a bank building. And here you can see, so it's, I think, 11 stories, and it's got it's an older office building. So it has it was built so every office had windows. And because of that, so here's the original layout. You can see how it worked. And also with that little, with the light well, it means that it is perfect for, you could reuse it as offices, but it's perfect for reusing as apartments. In fact, it would be even more perfect if the footprint were a little bit bigger, but this makes amazing apartments very easy to get lots and lots of light into all of the apartments. So this is another kind of stranded asset that's very easy to reuse. Now, this is an example in downtown Trenton, and this is more typical of newer, I think also suburban offices. So this is the old taxation building in downtown Trenton, and a very typical 1960s, 1970s, 80s office building with a large footprint. So reuse for offices, easy. Reuse for apartments, not so easy, and I'm not sure if I can, because each of these, that's a 20 to 25 foot structural grid. So one of those grids would be great to use for apartments, but when it ends up being 2 or 3 deep, it means there's a big chunk of the building on the middle that's hard to reuse or figure out what to use if the whole building is apartments. So certain uses for the, if you could find an office use for this, and other kinds of uses, but figuring out how to make it apartments is a little bit more difficult. So that's kind of a range of building reuses.
Very good. Thank you. So a lot of great stuff that you're doing in Trenton, and I think the Princeton Hydro won a New Good Neighbor Award from our magazine, which will the write-up will appear in our July issue. George, sticking with Trenton, what is Greater Trenton doing in alleviating the stranded asset problem in the city and promoting adaptive reuse? What are your programs?
Sure. A couple of things on that front. Before I answer that question, though, I thought John had some excellent examples in terms of buildings that can be repurposed, and really great examples in terms of how buildings used to be built. When you look at the old bank building, 28 West State Street, it had a smaller footprint, operable windows, had from the core to the elevators and things, to the exterior for the natural light. So it really is a great example of a building that can be converted. But as office buildings, and by the way, there's about 100, depending on what report you read, there's about 100 billion with a B of 100 billion square feet of office across America. And if you, again, depending on what report you use, there's somewhere between 10 and 20% vacancy. So there's about 1 billion to 2 billion square feet of vacant office across the country. So the numbers are staggering. And when you think about how office buildings evolved, footprints got larger. People wanted to have the cubicles and spread out over a large area. and they tend to get very deep. And so from a conversion perspective, it makes it very difficult. But again, things can be done. You can cut cores in, make large atriums and things. But again, it comes down to the economics and how do you make them work. But the older buildings generally have lower cost basis than the newer buildings, so you have more flexibility to make them work. But in terms of what we're doing, though, as an organization, I mentioned the residential market study is one really good example. And so we commissioned it. And I told people, if the results were good, we'd put a press release, we'll put a summary out, tell the world, try to get developers, investors, and others interested, including residents from within Trenton and far beyond Trenton. And if the results were bad, we would have buried it. No one would have ever seen it. So it was one that, but the results were great. And so at the end of the day, how do we try to match that demand with the supply that we have? Because I tell people here in Trenton, the supply-demand equation is true everywhere. It's economics 101. But how do you actually use the supply and match it with demand or create the demand that may not be here today? And so it's really trying to generate that interest, generate that investment, and entice other folks to come here and also be available for people within Trenton. Because I got to tell you, when you look at where the demand would be coming from, a lot of it would be coming from the city itself. People moving from within the city, in some cases inferior substandard type of units that would be moving into improved units, or just moving because they want to move to a new place. And so it's those kind of things that we're doing, working with the city, working with the county, working with the state, working with private sector, Clark Caton Hinson, John and his team, Mike McGuinness and NAIOP, Michelle and BIA and others throughout the city here to try to make sure that people know that Trenton's open for business and willing to get things done.
Very good. Well, we've heard about Trenton from John and George. Mike, what have you seen around the state regarding successful adaptive reuse? And could you give some examples and what made those projects work?
Well, there's quite a few. We've done many programs at NAB highlighting some of them. Our annual gala where we give out awards for deals of the year. Many of them are adaptive reuse projects. It's next Thursday. Just some of the signature projects you may have heard about. There's On 3 in Nutley, Bellworks in Holmdel, Hoboken Yard redevelopment, Hoboken. Ironside, Newark, that was industrial to office. Edison Lofts in West Orange, industrial to residential. Summit Health, Clifton Medical Retail Buildings was office to life science. You got the stretch on Raymond Boulevard in Newark, office to residential. We got the Randolph Apartments in Plainfield. That was a hospital to residential. Crate & Barrel Summit Medical in Clifton, office to medical. You have the Van Houten Street in Patterson. The old Silk Factory is going to a tremendous mixed-use facility, cultural center, whatever. What we've heard in terms of, tips for success, aside from financial incentives, which include the pilots, lots of homework. It's speaking with town officials early and often, touting the project's sustainability features, other types of benefits to the community, and then certainly having the right team in place to make decisions quickly to reduce time to market. So it's, and also you need to have the local government behind you. And I think there are some changes I would think would be helpful in legislative changes to streamline that process at the local level. So if a property is already has impervious surface, it's got the infrastructure, that redevelopment process should have a very quick, process for getting it to market. So maybe even the municipal land use law needs to be amended for an adaptive reuse sort of.
Okay, all right. I mean, going back perhaps 10 years, there was always talk about millennials wanting urban live, work, and play environments. Then COVID happened and everyone wanted open space. What's the scenario like today? How attractive are urban centers? And is the drive for live, work, play environment still a driving force behind adaptive reuse?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, absolutely it is. we'll have to see how this all plays out with the new, hybrid work environment. But I think New Jersey, unlike, Manhattan, which has a glut of, vacant office space, even though we call ourselves an urban state, we're really a suburban state. I mean, we have very little high rises in the state. We're, 560 whatever municipalities, and every municipality has its, desirable features.
Okay, thank you. And John, obviously, there are environmental and sustainability factors and benefits involved in all of this. Could you talk about that? Is this more of a discussion happening today?
Absolutely. So, one of the mantras of the historic preservation community is that the greenest building is the one that's already built. And also from our point of view, I think it's also, an existing building is less expensive to do, so it's got a sort of double benefits. What that means is that existing buildings have embodied carbon and embodied energy, and if you can reuse it, it's much more sustainable than even the most sustainable building that you can build new on a greenfield. So now, if you can combine that with high efficiency HVAC systems and insulation and all of that, it becomes a really, from a marketing point of view, it's something that we use to attract tenants, and whether it's residential or commercial. So.
Right. And from a marketing point of view, is that what are developers looking for that? Are they consciously aware they want to do the right thing environmentally?
Yes, so I'm also a developer. So yes, so that's what we use, and I think there are a lot of developers that are very aware of the marketing importance of green features and sustainability, because a larger and larger segment of folks that are looking for a place to live and work are looking for those kind of features.
Okay. You mentioned in our talks that some developers, not used to adaptive reuse, just want to tear down a building from and start from scratch. So how do you convince them? And what is it like to deal with that type of developer?
From an architect's point of view, it's difficult. So we don't often deal with developers who are coming from that point of view, just because of the kind of architecture firm that we are. But I think it's really a cost for a developer who doesn't have the natural inclination to want to restore a building. It really comes down to cost, to going through the numbers. And what is really important is finding a contractor, finding a builder who is familiar with dealing with historic and industrial buildings. So it really, if a developer is always working with a contractor who is doesn't want to deal with perceived complexity of renovating a building, they're always going to advise the developer to tear down and rebuild from new. If you're working with a contractor who has experience with historic buildings and existing buildings and understands how to manage those kinds of projects, they are less expensive, will take less time, and will make complete financial sense to the developer.
Okay, very good.
And Anthony, if I could just tag team on that question, though, I think John and David did a wonderful job with the Princeton hydro space. You just can't replicate the character of that building and that space. And when you think about how companies are trying to get their employees back into the office today, and you need to have interesting space and you need to have vibrant space, you want it to be transit-oriented, and that building meets all those and exceeds all those goals. And so in a competitive environment, in Princeton, Hydro is an environmental engineering firm. So when you're trying to attract professionals with that level of expertise to a location, this building meets all those goals. And so it really was a wonderful example. I commend you and David for bringing that building back to life, and the Lofts, because when you look at those buildings, you just can't replicate that. You can't create that. It'd be like Disney-esque, and you just can't afford to do that as a developer. But yet those buildings inherently had those features already in place. And then you combine the transit orientation that many buildings here in Trenton have. And so it really is a very unique city from that perspective. The connectivity that Trenton offers, combined with a lot of these stranded assets that Willard talked about, and as you drive through the city, already exist.
And we'll be making an announcement shortly about another tenant moving into that building.
Okay, great.
Another great tenant.
Okay. George, what's the best way to appease everyone involved in the process? Government, developers, businesses, the local community, et cetera?
Sure, engaging often and early to the extent possible. And it's always a balance, though, in terms of, the community will want certain things, developers need certain things, the lenders that will be lending money on a project want certain things, and how do you make that match? And so it's working closely with the government side, working closely with the public side, making sure you take into consideration all their needs. Again, it's not rocket science, but it's really trying to have that magic elixir, if you will, of trying to meet the many needs that people have. And a lot of times those needs may complement, many times they may compete with one another, and how do you best balance those needs with the reality of trying to get something done? And unfortunately, a lot of times folks that have never been responsible for delivering space or financing space, construction space, just have these aspirational goals that just don't meet with what may be here today. But how do you plan for the future and make sure that you include those type of things? For example, the electric car charging, it's a great example where a number of people drive electric cars today, and so you need to put charging stations in, or should be putting charging stations in, but how many do you need in the future? So maybe you pull empty conduit so you can actually have those charging stations in the future without having to tear up the parking lot, the sidewalks, and all those kind of things. But again, that's just one example of many that come to mind to make sure that you build for the future in anticipation of what that future may be, whatever that may be.
Okay, thanks. And Mike, given the economy right now, high interest rates, et cetera, higher building costs, not so sure about recession fears, but that's in the air. What is the scenario like, not just for stranded assets, but overall real estate development?
Well, okay. Yeah, so, well, today it's about stranded assets, right? So, just to start off with something that's booming and easy for me to think about is the industrial side, which we're starting to see a lot of the demand is it's leveling off, but certainly for the really large boxes that have been built, the vacancies are creeping up because I think the industrial type warehouse distribution centers, the demand is more in the under 500,000 square foot category. Office is still a challenge, but again, I think that's in the hybrid work culture. There's no question about it. Residential, affordable residential is what's in demand. Multifamily housing, and the office is what it is. I think New Jersey in a lot of the Class B buildings will have to be torn down probably. Some Bs can be converted to Class A, and but it's all over the place. But New Jersey has a very, I think, a great future ahead because we have so many vintage, properties in these community. A lot of older towns, a lot of them are served by rail or transit. So I think we have a great opportunity if the towns can get some help and figure it all out.
Okay. What I haven't heard in the conversations today is what about other other types of facilities for stranded asset reuse, recreational, cultural, education, et cetera. Any examples of that? Any of that going on?
I think Matt mentioned one earlier. The motion picture and television industry is booming.
Right.
And cannabis certainly, but I think those are two.
Yeah, but I'm talking about cultural, community,
Sure.
recreational, parks, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're working with a number of colleges and universities. I'll take Mercer County Community College. They have a downtown campus. They have purchased over the years a number of vacant buildings near their current buildings and redeveloped them for classrooms, an art gallery, and they have plans for bringing other programs to downtown. So, education is certainly an option, an opportunity. We're often looking at buildings for cultural uses, for theaters, or art uses. So all of those are options in these kinds of buildings.
Okay, very good.
But then, and that is part of the fabric, but also when you look at buildings, it's not just office buildings or industrial buildings that we're talking about. It's here in Trenton, we have 2 former hotels that are vacant now, and how do we reuse those buildings? Do they become residential? Do they become part hotel, part residential, part something else? And so you have that. We have former hospital here, St. Francis Hospital, for example. That site, Mercer Hospital, also a former hospital. So we have buildings that no longer meet their initial need, and how best to reuse them, or can they be used, and in what capacity? But it's all part of the fabric of the city, for sure, the cultural and all the other aspects.
Okay, very good. Talking about the overall environment, do you see the office market making somewhat of a comeback? Will things ever change? And of course, will stranded assets play a role in that?
Sure, I'd say absolutely. People, they may use the space differently. It may look different than it did yesterday, type of thing. But look, there's always going to be a need to come together, to have that dialogue, to have that camaraderie, if you will, to build the networks and things where, look, to do it remotely, to do it over a phone, do it over Zoom. How often are you still on Zoom calls today where the person speaking is still on mute? And it's kind of like, hello, And so it's different when it's in person. And you think about if anyone's in sales, the difference between going out, seeing someone eye to eye, making the deal, having the handshake, and breaking bread, whatever it happens to be, you can't replace that in person. Maybe I'm just old, but I just think you can't replace the in person with the electronic. And so I do think there's always going to be need for office for all those reasons and more.
George, I think, if I may, George said, you're old. I think that's something we all have to be conscious of, demographics. Who do you want in the office? Who's working in the office? How many people are retiring? So where's the new workforce coming from?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big consideration, I think, that everybody has to figure that out.
Okay, very good. Thank you. With that, we're going to start the Q&A. Does anyone have a question? Yes, Danielle.
Hello. So, issues in the banking in Wall Street. High interest rate, layoff in high income industries. How will that affect financing, tax incentives, and credit for future repurposing stranded assets and assets that may add to the inventory of stranded assets within the state and our country? There's a part 2 of this as well.
Good, lay it on us.
I can continue. So,
Quick answer to that, it makes it harder, but go on.
some of the stranded assets have chemical contamination. How can the DEP assess property owners with cost of commercial assets?
Well, I think a couple of those questions really relate to what EDA and what Dan Jennings mentioned earlier today. So EDA offers, through the Economic Recovery Act, a multifaceted tax credit package with those benefits being stackable. And so when you look at the environmental side, you can stack environmental with historic, with Aspire, there's Emerge, and literally there's over $1 billion a year with a B of tax credits available for that very purpose. And it's a gap financing program. And so to the extent the costs go up, there's a bigger gap, you get more credits. And it's not easy. It certainly isn't expensive, and it certainly isn't without its risk. But using government programs like that, it was created for exactly that type scenario, and there's more available credits for the higher expenses that may be incurred.
And one of the things that historically Trenton has done a good job on is addressing brownfield sites, and they've done a great job on cleanup and working with the state and the federal government on those cleanups. I don't know if we want to address the first question, the interest rates, all that stuff just makes redevelopment a lot more difficult, so.
Yeah, agreed, yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
So, gotta make sure the people in the Zoom can hear us, right? Thank you. This has really been great. My question is kind of, build it, they will come. Well, it's here and you market it. So we have all these great opportunities to market outside the state of New Jersey to attract people into New Jersey. How's that going? Like, you see people come go on CoStar, right? Like they check inventory, they look, and then maybe they reach out to you. What are you hearing about the attractability of New Jersey right now and the opportunity? Because I get really excited when I hear about all these great assets we have here and the opportunities for it, right? What do we need to do to drive the traffic either into the state or to these particular properties? Is this something bigger than just the fact that these properties have opportunity? Is there something else we need to be thinking about from an environmental perspective of business climate, et cetera?
I mean, we can't dismiss affordability. I mean, that's a huge part of the equation. So younger people, talent. Someone was at Willard said retail follows rooftops. I mean, or capital follows talent. So you need to have the workforce, the talent here, and then I think industry will come. I mean, the exception to that might have been the industrial sector, since of our geography, where we're located, the ports. I mean, clearly we're in an enviable spot for logistics because of that, and it still would suggest that we should be doing all we can for workforce training in that sector, and we're doing a lot, but I think it's all about the workforce and affordability that's a big issue.
Roger.
One of the issues, of course, is that we've found is property taxes, is taxes. So that's an issue, and that's why pilots are so important. When I first moved to New Jersey, to Trenton, when I heard about pilots, I was like, oh, that's terrible, giving developers a giveaway. And then when you do development, you realize, oh my God, I can't do it without a pilot. So one of the issues for many municipalities, and for Trenton in particular, is it has a high property tax rate, and so an answer to that must be found.
And then there's also the absolute and the relative piece to this, where I know Wes Matthews, for example, from Choose New Jersey, and his team do a great job attracting companies from out of the U.S. to New Jersey, because, again, the absolute and the relative cost of doing business, but then also the talent that Mike talked about, and quality of life aspects that New Jersey offers. We're never going to be the least expensive town or state by any means, but at the same time, the package that we offer in terms of the quality of life, the talent, the expertise that we have here that's unique to New Jersey, and that's really where we have to sell. If you want to be the low-cost alternative, we're not that. And you know better than anyone, Michelle, we're not the low-cost alternative. You can go down south, and if it's all about the last nickel, you're not going to find it here. But it's really the value, and I think Amazon taught us a great lesson. When you think about that HQ2, now, again, it didn't materialize to the extent anyone thought for any number of reasons, but Amazon HQ2, you think about that process, 236 submissions across North America. New Jersey offered $7 billion with a B to go to Newark, essentially get a free headquarters, and they said no. And why was that? They ended up going down to basically Washington and New York had other issues. They didn't end up there, but it's all about the talent and how do they grow the top line. Where those of us in real estate think about real estate and how much it costs for the building and things, but that's just a line item in many expenses for a company like Amazon and every other company for that matter. And it really came down to how do you grow your top line and how do you have the best talent in place to grow your sales and make the income, which will eventually become the bottom line.
Yeah.
Good point.
Very true.
John? Oh, I thought you were going to
No, it was just it.
Oh, okay.
Excellent point.
Any other questions? Okay. With that, thank you very much.
There's a
Oh, I'm
question
sorry.
back.
One last.
All the way back there, okay.
Good morning. Trenton does have a pretty robust water system with excess capacity, considering when we look historically about all the industry that it fed that's not here anymore. Has any of the site selection efforts, George, been focused on attracting businesses that have a high water demand?
Not to date, Ann, be honest with you. It seems like industries, we've had more success speaking with people looking to move into the city more from a residential or from an office rather than industry, even though Trenton has such a rich industrial past, if you mean just from a manufacturing side, but also how do we engage the river better from a recreational and a vibrancy perspective. That's all part of the package as well. But we haven't seen a lot of industries from the water perspective looking to come into Trenton, because that's one aspect. But then when you look at the cost of energy and all the other aspects that go along with that, we just haven't seen that.
I will say, I did just recently get an inquiry about a hydroponics use and, and urban gardening, an interior gardening project. So there is some interest in that. People who are looking for those locations. Yeah, well, yes. I forgot about those. We've been meeting with those as well.
Anyone else? I'm not missing anyone else back there? Can't see. All right. Well, thank you very much. Great incentives from the state and the municipality, Trenton. Everyone's working, diligently to get these assets redeveloped. And thank you all for coming. I don't know if Michelle had some comments. Okay.